darunter die beiden Schlachtschiffe Gneisenau und Scharnhorst, operierten.
Night of February 26, 1942. In Kiel, Gneisenau lies in a floating dry dock, her bow under repair after the Channel dash. She has survived Norway, Atlantic raiding, submarine attack, and months under British bombs at Brest. Now, before she can return to sea, the bombers come again. A heavy bomb drives through the forward section and reaches the ammunition spaces below. Moments later, the bow erupts in a catastrophic explosion. Steel is torn open, fires race through the ship, and more than 100 men are killed. Gneisenau had been built to outrun stronger enemies and strike where Britain was weak. In Kiel, trapped and unable to move, she is broken for the final time. This is the story of Gneisenau. Gneisenau was one of the two Scharnhorst-class capital ships built for Nazi Germany's naval rearmament in the 1930s. Laid down at Deutsche Werke in Kiel on the 6th of May 1935, launched on the 8th of December 1936, and commissioned on the 21st of May 1938, she entered service before the war as one of the most modern large warships in Europe. German service classified her as a battleship. British observers often preferred the term battlecruiser, mostly because her main battery was smaller than that of many contemporary battleships. In practice, the distinction mattered less than the role she was meant to perform. Fast enough to choose her fights, armoured enough to survive cruiser action, and strong enough to threaten convoy routes on the open ocean. At full load, she displaced about 38,000 tons. She measured roughly 753 feet in overall length. 3 geared steam turbines drove 3 shafts and gave her a top speed of about 31 knots. Excellent performance for a ship of her size. That speed was central to the whole design. Germany's surface fleet was too small to seek a classic fleet action against the Royal Navy, but a fast raider could still impose strategic pressure if it remained at sea long enough and if it could outrun stronger opposition when necessary. Her main armament consisted of 9 11-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, 2 forward and 1 aft. These guns were smaller than the larger weapons mounted by many rival capital ships, but they were accurate, rapid-firing for their caliber, and more than adequate against cruisers or armed merchantmen. Secondary 5.9-inch guns, heavy anti-aircraft batteries, torpedo tubes, and aircraft facilities completed the design. She also carried Arado seaplanes for reconnaissance, because a ship like Gneisenau was expected not only to fight, but to find the enemy first. Yet, her early trials revealed an early flaw. She shipped heavy seas over the bow. The original bow form was inadequate, and the ship had to be rebuilt with a higher Atlantic bow before she was truly ready for open ocean operations. Even in design, Gneisenau was a compromise between firepower, speed, and seaworthiness. Gneisenau's first significant wartime action came in November 1939, when she and Scharnhorst were sent to attack the Northern Patrol between Iceland and the Faroe Islands. The mission was meant to disrupt British watchlines and force the Royal Navy to react. On November 23rd, the 2 German ships found the armed merchant cruiser HMS Rawalpindi. She was hopelessly outmatched. Rawalpindi was a converted passenger liner carrying old 6-inch guns. Gneisenau and Scharnhorst were fast capital ships with 18 11-inch guns between them. Captain Edward Kennedy of Rawalpindi understood the situation immediately. He is remembered for the words he spoke when surrender was the obvious course. "We'll fight them both, they'll sink us, and that will be that." It was a hopeless decision in tactical terms, but not a useless one. Rawalpindi got off reports that German heavy units were at sea, forcing the British to react and turning what might have been a clean raiding sortie into a wider operational problem for the attackers. The action itself was short and violent. Scharnhorst opened fire first, and Gneisenau joined minutes later. Rawalpindi returned fire and even managed one hit on Scharnhorst that caused minor splinter damage. But the outcome had never been in doubt. She was set ablaze and eventually sank with heavy loss of life. Around 238 men were killed. German ships rescued a number of survivors, but the appearance of British forces in the dark forced them to break off. The engagement mattered because it showed both the promise and the limitation of Gneisenau's role. She could crush weaker ships with ease, but in doing so, she also revealed her position and brought the Royal Navy down upon her. In April 1940, Gneisenau took part in Operation Weserübung, the German invasion of Norway. she and Scharnhorst served as the heavy cover force for the landing operations at Narvik and Trondheim. On the morning of April 9th, off the Norwegian coast and in heavy seas, they encountered HMS Renown. This was exactly the kind of fight German surface ships were supposed to avoid unless conditions strongly favoured them. The battle was short and confused, shaped as much by weather as by gunnery. Renown scored telling hits. One 15-inch shell knocked out Gneisenau's main fire control director, while lighter caliber hits damaged the rangefinder on the forward turret. Gneisenau and Scharnhorst used their higher speed and the bad weather to disengage. The action did not destroy Gneisenau, but it exposed the vulnerability beneath her reputation. Against a stronger British capital ship in poor visibility and heavy seas, speed offered escape, not dominance. 2 months later, during Operation Juno, Gneisenau and Scharnhorst achieved one of Germany's most dramatic surface victories of the war. On the 8th of June 1940, they intercepted the aircraft carrier HMS Glorious and the destroyers HMS Ardent and HMS Acasta. The carrier had no combat air patrol aloft and little warning time. The German ships opened fire at long range and quickly found the target. Glorious was hit repeatedly and set ablaze. The destroyers fought back fiercely, and Acasta managed to torpedo Scharnhorst before going down. Gneisenau emerged unscathed from the action itself, but the battle reinforced the pattern already visible in her career: tactical success followed by operational damage elsewhere. That damage came less than 2 weeks later. On June 20th, 1940, while sailing off Trondheim with Admiral Hipper and destroyer escort, Gneisenau was torpedoed in the bow by the British submarine HMS Clyde. The torpedo struck forward, caused heavy flooding in the bow compartments, and forced the ship back to Trondheim for temporary repairs before she could return to Kiel. It was the first great interruption in her career, and it mattered because it began a cycle that would never truly stop: sortie, success or escape, heavy damage, long repair. From that point onward, Gneisenau would spend almost as much of the war under repair as at sea. By early 1941, Gneisenau was back in service and joined Scharnhorst for Operation Berlin, Germany's most successful Atlantic surface raid of the war. The concept was simple and strategically sound. The two ships would break into the Atlantic, avoid battleships, strike weakly defended shipping, and remain at large long enough to force Britain to scatter heavy forces across enormous sea spaces. A battleship sunk in battle would be a disaster. A battleship loose in the Atlantic was a strategic problem. The first breakout attempt in late December 1940 was disrupted by severe weather, and Gneisenau had to return for repairs. The two ships sailed again under Admiral Günther Leuchens. British forces tried to intercept them in the passages between Iceland and the Faroes, but German radar and squall cover helped them evade the patrol line. By early February, they had broken into the open Atlantic. What followed was a 2-month commerce raid conducted with a caution that frustrated some German officers, but made operational sense. Leuchens was under orders not to engage enemy capital ships. Twice the pair found convoys escorted by British battleships and broke off. Instead, they hunted isolated ships and poorly protected traffic. Off West Africa and in the North Atlantic, they struck dispersed merchantmen with methodical effect. By the time they reached Brest on the 22nd of March 1941, they had sunk or captured 22 ships totaling roughly 115,600 gross register tons. Operation Berlin was Gneisenau at her most effective. She had not fought a great fleet battle. She had done something strategically more useful: threaten British shipping while forcing the Royal Navy to spread strength across the Atlantic. Yet the raid also set up the next stage of her destruction. Brest brought the German ships close to Atlantic lanes, but it also placed them under the reach of the RAF. Once Gneisenau entered Brest, her chief enemy was no longer the Royal Navy at sea. It was Bomber Command. Churchill later described the problem plainly in the House of Commons. The Brest ships, he said, had become a serious preoccupation for the Admiralty. Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and later Prince Eugen lay on the flank of major convoy routes and threatened both the Atlantic and approaches to the Mediterranean. Britain could not ignore them, but neither could it easily destroy them outright. The result was a long air siege. On the night of March 30th to March 31st, 1941, and again on April 4th to April 5th, British bombers attacked Brest. Then on April 6th came one of the boldest anti-shipping air attacks of the war. Flying Officer Kenneth Campbell, piloting a Beaufort torpedo bomber at extremely low level through intense fire, pressed home an attack against Gneisenau in the harbour. The later Victoria Cross citation captured the essence of it. By pressing home his attack at close quarters in the face of a withering fire, Campbell crippled the ship and did not survive the mission. His torpedo struck Gneisenau near the stern and flooded compartments, disabling one propeller shaft and causing major underwater damage. The attacks did not stop there. RAF bombers again struck Gneisenau in port. Several bombs hit the forward superstructure area. Some exploded on the armoured deck. Others failed to detonate, but the damage was still severe. The raid killed 72 men outright and wounded around 90 more. Fire, blast, and structural damage put a large part of the ship out of action and extended repairs yet again. Gneisenau was learning the hard truth of the air age. A capital ship in harbour could be neutralised almost as effectively as one sunk at sea. By early 1942, Brest had become untenable. Germany faced a choice: leave Gneisenau and the other heavy ships under continued British air attack, or run them back to Germany through the English Channel itself. The result was Operation Cerberus, better known as the Channel Dash. Gneisenau, Scharnhorst, and Prinz Eugen slipped out of Brest and raced up the channel under heavy Luftwaffe cover. It was one of the most daring naval movements of the war. British detection came late, command response was fragmented, and attacks were delivered piecemeal. Torpedo bombers, coastal forces, mines, and gunfire all failed to stop the German breakout. In strategic terms, Cerberus was a German success. The ships escaped Brest and returned to home waters. But it was not a clean victory. Gneisenau struck a magnetic mine during the operation and took additional damage. The breakout freed her from one trap only to send her directly into dry dock for more repair. In hindsight, the Channel Dash also marked the end of Gneisenau as an Atlantic raider. She had escaped, but she would never again return to the open Atlantic as she had in 1941. The decisive blow came almost immediately after Cerberus. In late February 1942, Gneisenau was in floating dry dock at Kiel, still under repair and intended for further service. Ammunition had been reloaded in preparation for trials and redeployment. On the night of February 26th and 27th, RAF bombers hit the harbour. One bomb penetrated the forecastle, passed through the armoured deck, and exploded deep in the ship near the forward ammunition spaces. Red-hot fragments ignited propellant charges, and the resulting fire reached the forward magazine. What followed was the catastrophic explosion that effectively ended Gneisenau's career as a combat ship. The blast blew the forward turret off its seating, gutted the entire bow section, and left the ship devastated from the front almost back to the bridge. The explosion killed 112 men and wounded 21 more. This was the moment when Gneisenau ceased to be a warship in the normal sense. She still floated. Her machinery aft was not entirely destroyed, but the damage was so extensive that repair in existing form no longer made much sense. The naval staff chose instead to rebuild her to carry 6 15-inch guns, the heavier armament many had always believed she should have had. The reconstruction decision looked bold on paper. Gneisenau's shattered bow would be removed, a new and longer bow added, and the existing 3 triple 11-inch turrets replaced with 3 twin 15-inch mountings. It would have transformed her into a more conventionally powerful battleship carrying the same guns as the Bismarck class. But it also required time, labour, dockyard effort, and strategic patience that Germany increasingly did not possess. Gneisenau moved to Gotenhaffen in April 1942 and was formally decommissioned on July 1st. Her crew was largely dispersed, many of them transferred to the U-boat arm. Main guns and secondary batteries were removed for coastal defence. One of her triple turrets eventually went to Ostrov Fort in Norway, where it survived the war. The ship herself sat increasingly as a stripped hull awaiting a reconstruction that had already begun to lose political backing. Then came the Barents Sea disaster in December 1942. The failure of German surface forces in that Arctic action infuriated Hitler and shattered what little confidence remained in the major surface fleet. His reaction was blunt. "It is now my irrevocable decision," he said, "to do away with these useless ships." That did not mean Gneisenau was immediately broken up, but it did mean the reconstruction ceased to be a serious priority. By early 1943, work effectively stopped. The ship would never fire in anger again. Gneisenau's final act came in the last weeks of the war. By March 1945, the Red Army was closing in on Gotenhaffen, and Germany's Baltic ports had become evacuation points, supply nodes, and improvised defensive positions all at once. In that setting, the gutted hull of Gneisenau still had one final use. She could be sunk as a block ship. On March 27, 1945, the remaining crew took the hulk out into the harbour entrance area at Gotenhaffen and scuttled her. There was no fleet engagement, no final sortie, no last exchange of gunfire. The ship that had hunted in the Atlantic and broken through the Channel ended her war as a barrier of steel sunk by her own side to delay an enemy advance. After the war, the wreck remained in place until post-war salvage operations gradually raised and dismantled it. By 1951, the remains had been broken up for scrap. In the end, Gneisenau disappeared, not in a single heroic instant, but by stages: damaged, repaired, damaged again, gutted, disarmed, abandoned, and finally sunk. Gneisenau's career shows how a major warship could be destroyed without ever suffering the classic end of a battleship. She was not annihilated in a final fleet action. Instead, she was worn down by the changing realities of naval war. At sea, she could still be dangerous. Operation Berlin proved that. But her operational life was repeatedly interrupted by torpedoes, bombs, mines, and repair cycles long enough to remove her from the decisive phases of the war. Brest showed what air power could do to capital ships in harbour. Kiel showed what a single bomb could do to a ship already trapped by circumstance. The failed reconstruction after 1942 showed how quickly industrial ambition could collapse once strategy and politics turned against it. By the time Gneisenau was scuttled at Gotenhaffen, Germany's surface fleet had already lost the war in every meaningful sense. That is what makes Gneisenau so revealing. She began the war as one of Germany's most modern and promising surface units. She helped sink Rawalpindi, fought through Norway, helped destroy Glorious, raided the Atlantic successfully, endured Brest, and escaped in the Channel Dash. Yet she still ended as a powerless hull sunk in a retreating harbour. Her story is not one of a single dramatic sinking. It is the story of a capital ship gradually broken by the war she had been built to win.